Perfect.
Yeah, I'm not the best Skype guy. I usually do only audio.
Yeah. No. It's okay. We like to do both. I mean, most people will just listen to the podcast, but some people will watch. So we just make it as an option here. So yeah. So you are Daniel de Visé, right? De Visé or de Visé?
De Visé. It's Belgian.
Oh, de Visé. Oh, yes, of course. So there we go. The new book, The Comeback. Greg LeMond, the true king of American cycling and a legendary Tour de France. So for most of my listeners, they're not going to be into geeking out about cycling like we will. But so this is a little bit unusual, but we will angle in some science and technology and game theory throughout this. But just to give you a proper introduction here, this is just your latest book of several you've done before, Andy and Don, The Making of a Friendship in a Classic American TV Show. Of course, that's the Mayberry. No, sorry. What's the name of the show?
Andy Griffith Show.
Andy Griffith Show, yeah. That was a great show. I grew up with that. And co-author of I Forgot to Remember, a memoir of amnesia. You live in Maryland, and you are a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2001 for your journalistic writing and research, and a graduate of Wesleyan and Northwestern universities. So very good. So I think just to give our listeners a kind of a general background of why you came to write this book. You've written on so many different topics in your journalism. How did you get into writing about cycling, and why Greg LeMond?
Yeah, a great question, and especially if people listening to this aren't all cycling buffs. Anyone who's familiar with The Boys in the Boat or Seabiscuit knows those as great works of narrative nonfiction that are sort of only nominally concerning the sports that they're about. By which I mean, I read Seabiscuit and loved it, and I'm not a horse racing fan at all.
Right.
And I read The Boys in the Boat and was very inspired by that, and not a rower, And the reason I liked them is that they are great stories that traverse many great literary conflicts of the sort that you learn about in a high school English class. And I wrote this book very much in that spirit. I was walking around my suburb, Garrett Park, one day a few years ago, and it just struck me that thing with LeMond where he got shot and then came back and won the Tour was a wonderful narrative to tell, and something that I bet that I thought probably a lot of people, even of my generation and yours, wouldn't really remember, because you know how little most regular people know about LeMond even now. I mean, he's virtually forgotten if you're not a cycling buff.
Mm-hmm.
So that was why I did it. And I'm not a sports writer, God knows, not a cycling writer. And there's a great many of them, and they're wonderful, but I'm not one. I'm really a biographer and a narrative nonfiction guy. And as you see, each of these books has been different, but what they've had in common is each of them felt strong as sort of biographical topics, and they're all things I know. I was a crazy bicycle guy when I was younger. I watched, maybe we discussed this, my father and I watched the Race Across America every year. He was fascinated by it because he'd ridden across America as a child, and that was must-see TV for us back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. And when I was doing that in the 80s, that's when LeMond was at his peak, and he was by far and away the most famous cyclist. Before LeMond, there was really nobody, unless you go all the way back to the first page of your photo layout, and most Americans will have no idea about Major Taylor and Frank Kramer and what a huge sport cycling was at the turn of the century. It would be like the NFL today, or NBA basketball, or something like that, just hugely popular in America before cars became even really very big.
And then cars, I think, were sort of the undoing in some ways of the cycling sport in this country. They sort of shoved the bicycles off the road, along with, World War I and Depression and other things like that. But there was this wonderful age of discovery. I devote a chapter to it in the book. People like the Wright brothers, I think, were involved in making bicycles, and Henry Ford.
They were bike mechanics.
Yeah. And Henry Ford was involved, I think, in either fixing or making bicycles. So there was this wonderful cross-pollination among these three different disciplines. If the great historian Peter Nye were with us, he could talk about this in great length, but he's not. But I learned a lot from his book, Hearts of Lions, and other books that I had no idea it was such a big deal. I knew my pop did it in this colony of immigrants. He was from Belgium, back in the 40s he was racing, but it was a fringe sort of deadhead sort of subculture thing. You know, it wasn't mainstream at all.
Right. I think Americans have a sense of how big soccer is elsewhere, and it's getting bigger in the United States last few decades, but it's huge in Europe. But even bigger really is the Tour de France and the number of people that come out to watch the sport. And it's been that way, for most of the 20th century. But the point is often made that, Major Taylor would, if he was alive today, he'd be like Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan or, somebody really huge and successful as an African-American athlete. And there's several attempts to get a film made, a biopic. John Howard, the American cyclist, is one of those trying to get a Major Taylor film.
Great.
Yeah, they have some actors attached, and they've got some footage for a trailer you can see online. They're just trying to find the funding for it.
And for people who might be listening and not even know who the heck that is, he was the first African-American world champion, I think, in any significant sport.
Right.
Around the turn of the century, right? The turn of the last century.
Yeah.
He was the dominant, I think, bicycle racer in America for a number of years and very well paid in his day, both in money and bizarre trinkets and horses and property, and God knows what they gave the winners of races back then. And I think he was finally eclipsed by Kramer, and then Kramer, who you mentioned, wound up in his day being more oft-cited in the New York Times than any baseball player. I mean, I think I think he was written about more often than, say, Napoli Joey, who led the league one year and earned more than Ty Cobb. But this is all forgotten,
right.
Utterly forgotten 100 and whatever years later.
Yeah, that's right. And but back to how we started, I think there is something pure about sports that allows even non-sporting fans to explore the human condition and just think about competition and human nature, and because there's something about, like in my sport cycling, when you're out riding or racing with people, no one cares who you are. Your reputation doesn't matter. Your socioeconomic class doesn't matter. Your religion doesn't matter. Your politics don't matter. It's just really, there's something of a purity about it's just you're out there physically performing against yourself and against others and against the environment or whatever the sport is. So I think that's part of the appeal of books like you mentioned, that allows us to kind of look at human nature uncontaminated by other factors to a certain extent.
And so what caused you to discover cycling at the end of the 70s, I think it was? Were you swept up into the whole kind of breaking away thing, or was it just part of that
actually,
whole
I got into it
fitness trend?
Just before breaking away. And to our listeners, just a delightful film along the same lines of what we've been talking about. It's not really a cycling film. It's a film about coming of age and leaving home and all that. And that was, I think, 1980. That film came out, and I got into the sport in 79. No, I had graduated with my master's degree in experimental psych, and I couldn't find a teaching job. I just wanted to be a college professor because that just seemed like a great gig to do. But there were no jobs at the time. There was a big hiring freeze. This was in the state of California. I didn't want to leave California. They just passed Prop 13 that cut property tax from 4% to 1%.
Oh yeah.
And so a lot of that money had been going into the public educational system. So all colleges and universities put a hiring freeze on in the fall of 1979, and that's when I was, looking for work. So I just went to the placement office at the university, Cal State Fullerton, and said, I need a job. And they said, well, what can you do? I said, nothing. I'm a student. I have no skills other than I really like to write. I'd love to be a writer, and so we looked under that category, and there was a job at a bicycle magazine as a writer and editor. So I was like, okay, whatever. I don't know anything about cycling, but it doesn't matter. I just want to be a writer. So my first day on the job, they sent me to cover a press conference by Cycles Peugeot of this guy, John Marino, who had just ridden across America and broke the Guinness Book of Records, 13 days, 1 hour and 20 minutes, riding the 3,100 miles, whatever it was. And he lived just like 4 miles from me. And I thought, boy, this is a super interesting guy, and maybe I'll just get a bike and go ride with John Marino. And I did. And it just sort of took off from there. The next week, I went to a 50-kilometer road race in Griffith Park. It was sort of an open event that anybody could enter, so I did. But they had like the pro elites take off first, and Jonathan Boyer won, and I'd never heard of him, of course, but he was the first American to ride in the Tour de France, and he was quite the superstar in that little sport, and he looked pretty sleek and cool in his gear, and he's a handsome guy, and I thought, oh man, this is a pretty cool sport. So I just got into it that way. And
you must have had some natural gift. I mean, you were doing hundreds of miles a week.
Well, I was an athlete all my life. I played baseball. This is before soccer, so I played baseball in the 60s. And then I got into tennis in college. I had a roommate at Pepperdine who was a tennis pro. So he from New Zealand. Chris Gunning was his name. He put himself through college as on a tennis scholarship, but really he was a pro. This was Malibu campus at Pepperdine, and he used to give lessons to Paul Newman. This was pretty cool. Paul Newman would call our dorm room. It's really funny. I told my mom this one day. She about fainted because she was a huge Paul Newman fan. Paul Newman called you? Yeah. He said, hello, is Chris there? I'm like, oh. Anyway, so, but I was, pretty into sports and stuff like that. So. Yeah, so, Le Monde came on the scene right around that time. I think 81, 82 is when he was a junior and starting to win a lot of those junior championships and that sort of thing. So he came on my radar. And that's really when the sport really started to take off. Everyone listening will know who Lance Armstrong is, of course. But it was like that, and when there was nobody knew anything about the sport. Yeah. I mean, people had to explain, what drafting was and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, Le Monde, I think I was just an avid fan and a cyclist. I didn't do as many miles as you did, but what I recall is the race across the Great American Bicycle Race started, I think, around 82.
Yeah, 82.
And my pop and I watched that on TV on very nice network coverage for a couple years, and then we gradually became aware. I think maybe by 84, which is a couple years later, that Le Monde was starting to do things at the Tour. And we'd been watching the Tour, I think, but there wasn't much coverage of it because it was French guys. And then when Le Monde started creeping up, he finished third the first time he entered. But once he was a guy in the peloton, then suddenly it wasn't like Lance, because there wasn't this secondary massive factor of cancer survivor. Which brought millions of people into the Lance phenomenon, right, who wouldn't have otherwise been there. It was just this wonderful real-life breaking away scenario. And, he got big. I mean, he wasn't huge, but he became fairly well-known fairly quickly.
Yeah, and that really helped put the sport on the map because the American press covered it like, wow, who's this American kid is going over there to show the Europeans how it's done. And he did in many ways. I mean, Lance became pretty wealthy as a cyclist, but it was really Greg that set the pattern for that it's okay to make money. In fact, it's not only okay, it's good. It's good for athletes to have representation and agents and be well paid for their craft. And that was already happening in other sports, but Greg made that happen for cycling.
Greg and his father, Bob Le Monde, who was his manager and his negotiator, and went over to France and sort of appalled them at the beginning by demanding big money for his boy, they knew he was going to be not just a very popular cyclist, but also entree to maybe an American market. So they knew, I'm sure they were salivating over getting him. But I don't think they'd ever seen the like of a cyclist. This is a blue-collar profession in Europe, right? It was blue-collar, and the average domestique was earning the equivalent of about $12,000 a year. And then here Greg and Bob, his father, come over and say they want, $300,000 or something, and it was seen as very distasteful.
Right.
But once he'd gotten the first $1 million contract, and the theory behind it, as you alluded to, in America, there was already in the 80s a recognition that a shelf life for a big star athlete is fairly brief. You might have 5 years at the top if you're lucky, maybe shorter than that if you're a football person. So the idea is to pack a lifetime of earnings into a short span. So you get now a $10, $15, $20 million athlete. But even then in baseball and basketball, they were making, 7 figures. So from an American perspective, that wasn't outlandish at all, but it was unprecedented in professional cycling, and as a result, Greg briefly out-earned Bernard Hinault, who was the patron, the king of the peloton. But things righted themselves, and eventually they all were earning that much.
Yeah, and our listeners should also remember that that's the way all sports were before, say, the late 60s, when players were really just practically slave labor to the owners of teams. The owners could do anything they wanted with them, trade them, whatever. You had no choice. And this was really before big agents and lawyers and unions and things like that. The reason players fought for that, I think it was Curt Flood in baseball, maybe 1968 or so, who pioneered that players should have a say in their future, and how much they make can be negotiated rather than the owners just really practically own you. And, back the famous Babe Ruth and Joe DiMaggio and all these great players, I mean, they were really just employees and mostly at the whim of the bosses, the owners of the teams.
To your point, I'm from Chicago, and at one point in the 70s when I was a boy, my father took me to meet Ernie Banks, who was the greatest Cub ever. And after retirement, he was working a day job, 9 to 5, in a bank.
Oh, my God.
And I wonder if they gave it to him because of his name.
His name, yeah.
And that was how he supported himself in his probably 50s. And it would be astonishing to imagine anybody at anywhere near that level having to take a job,
right?
After retiring after I think 20 years in the majors, but he had to have a job.
Right. Yep. So that gives us kind of a general background. The book title, "The Comeback," I like because it has multiple meanings. Of course, his comeback in that one particular Tour de France to win at the end by 8 seconds, which is now famous. But his own comeback, actually, from being shot on death's door, and so coming back from that, and then in a third sense, as I read it anyway, maybe that's how you meant it, or not, I don't know. But come back from being in Lance's shadow for so long, and now we know everybody knows what happened to Lance, and who is this Greg LeMond guy? So it's a little bit of a comeback for Greg in the public eye, like, oh yeah, that's right, who is this guy?
Well, I see it as this book, and I'm not talking about my writing, just the material, I think is very, very strong. It's sort of like a day in the Pyrenees at the Tour. You have a series of sort of HC climbs beyond categorization. They're so steep. And sorry, this is hokey, but the first one is that Greg suffers sexual abuse as a boy,
right.
And he gets through it, he gets past it, he survives it. And I theorize in the book, and I'm probably not the first person to think of this, that it was the shame and humiliation and pain of sexual abuse, perhaps, that drove him to do the hundreds of miles a week on his bicycle. All you guys who ride that much have some kind of demons, Mm-hmm. It's just a question of what. And nobody's ever disputed this when I've said it at my book talks. And that was Greg's. Cycling, it released good natural drugs into his body. It focused his mind it on one thing, which is the road beneath him, took his mind off of whatever had been before. So that's that's just one. And then, comeback number two, or it's not a comeback, but the second hurdle, the second big conflict is this American going to effing Europe and mastering professional cycling, which was an entirely European sport. I think Jock Boyer was literally the only American who had preceded Greg in entering the Tour. And for Greg to do anything in professional cycling, I think would be akin to a Belgian coming and joining the Yankees and pitching them into the World Series or something, just insane. And then sort of the climax of that sort of second act in the book would be Greg's victory in 1986, the first American to win the Tour de France, competing against the greatest cyclist probably on earth, Bernard Hinault, but also competing against the entire nation of France. I mean, literally every last French person from, I think, Mitterrand on down was allied with Hinault, as were most of Greg's teammates and Hinault's teammates. So for him to conquer that Tour, to win against such odds, was astonishing. And there's a book called Slaying the Badger, mm-hmm. that was made into an ESPN documentary, which is an extraordinary retelling of just that story. I mean, I do it in my book, but if you want to really dive into that, that's where you go. Then after that, and sorry, I'm being
No,
long-winded,
this is
but
perfect. This is great.
then Greg, right when he should be coming back and defending his crown, he gets shot on I think it's a turkey hunt or a pheasant hunt in Lincoln, California, outside Sacramento. Nearly bleeds out. I did not know that when I set out to write the book, how near to death he'd come. And the reason neither of us knew that was that they hid that fact from the press.
Mm-hmm.
The little squibs that were written about that really underplayed what had happened, because Greg underplayed it because he didn't want to lose his job. But he nearly died. And I've asked this question at 20 some book talks, and I've yet to learn of another example of an athlete in an aerobic sport, not golf, an aerobic sport, who's come back from the brink of death to the top of said sport. And that is what Greg accomplished over the next 2 years. It is, I think, unprecedented, and really without precedent all the way up until you get to Lance Armstrong, which is a bizarre fact that there are two people, each of whom came back from near death to the top of the same sport, which is arguably the most difficult sport on earth. So that's bizarre. But so that's the centerpiece of the book. And then you have two more acts that follow. And very briefly, Greg diminishes as he enters the 1990s, and he can't figure out why he's suddenly not winning any longer, even though he's just as powerful of a cyclist. Oh, you still have dogs, huh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He's diminishing and can't figure out why, and we only find out later. And we, the readers, know what's going on, but I don't say it because I'm in the moment as I'm writing it.
Yeah.
That it is EPO, the wonder drug that has crept into the peloton and has defeated him finally. The most physically gifted cyclist, of his generation, was finally undone by drugs. And then there's one final act, and it's probably the hardest part of the book to read. It was certainly hard to write, and this is where Lance Armstrong goes mano a mano against Greg, because Greg becomes one of the first people to call out Lance to accuse him of cheating. And at the time when Greg did this in 2001, the entire American press and most of the fans thought he was, a god. And this was sort of like in baseball what would happen if Hank Aaron accused Barry Bonds of doping, which I don't think ever happened. But had it happened, it would have been a big deal. So that was an explosive accusation.
Yep.
And Armstrong brought out all of his big guns in response, and Greg was laid low and exiled from his sport, really ostracized from it for the next dozen years. And there he would remain, but for the sequence of events that brought down Lance's career, 12 years later. And that's kind of the end of the book, is Greg's comeback from that ostracism back to the center where he belonged of the American cycling universe.
Yeah. That's a perfect encapsulation. It's a great read. It is like Seabiscuit or one of these other type books. So I would encourage people to read it just as a gripping narrative story. EPO was a game changer for sure in the early 90s, but everybody knows that doping has always been a part of cycling all the way back to the early 20th century. And, famous stories of cyclists in the Tour de France in the 40s and 50s and 60s taking all kinds of just crazy stuff just to suppress pain. And I don't think any of this actually worked to the extent something like EPO would to enhance your performance. It would be more like just to deal with the suffering, something like that.
Did competitors in the race across America take stuff?
I don't know. There was no drug testing early on. I never did anything, and I don't know that anybody ever did. So this in the early 80s, the only thing you could have done that would have made a difference was blood doping, and that wasn't even banned. And I knew some of the American cyclists in the 1984 Olympics who were blood doping. And just a quick explanation of that: you draw your own blood out and store it, and then reinfuse it just before you need it before a big event or race. Not just cyclists were doing it, but soccer players and tennis players and so on. Apparently, a lot of athletes were doing this, swimmers maybe, and it wasn't illegal because it wasn't really a drug. You're just packing your own blood back in there. Now that's a little. I remember when I first heard about that, I thought, oh boy, because I had a back surgery when I was 19, when I was in college. I had a tumor on my spine, and I had to have and I'd been taking a ton of aspirin every day, like a couple of dozen aspirin a day, just to deal with the pain. and because they didn't know what it was. And so finally, when they discovered this tumor, I had to go in for emergency surgery because it was really close to my spine. It was on the spine, but close to the the nerves and stuff. So so when they did the surgery, I was bleeding like crazy because of all the aspirin. So they gave me a bag of blood, and it was contaminated with what at the time was just called jaundice. They said, "Oh, you got yellow jaundice." I'm like, "Well, what's that?" Well, don't worry about it. Well, it turns out this is hepatitis C I got, and that wasn't clearly identified until I did this surgery in 1975 till like a decade later. It's like, oh, Hep C, you got Hep C. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. No symptoms or anything. I didn't even know really what it was all about until I turned 50, and I went to get some more life insurance, and so they sent a guy up to my house to draw some blood, just to do some more testing. So they just sent me this note back going, you better go see your doctor because you have Hep C. I'm like, what? I do. I remember the jaundice thing, but that's what I have.
Wow.
And but I remember at the time thinking, back to the blood doping thing, thinking, yeah, I don't know. They told me I should never give blood because I had this jaundice thing, and I don't know, needles and blood and storing it in your refrigerator or using a relative's blood. It just sounded pretty, yuck. Needles.
And kind of dangerous too, right?
And dangerous, and it is dangerous for sure. It's dangerous. And now we know there are stories. Tyler Hamilton talks about that in The Secret, his book about the Secret Race, called, about how one of the bags of blood he had got contaminated. Too many red blood cells died or whatever, and he injects himself back in, and he's sicker than a dog. And so actually he decreases performance. But I never did anything. I don't know if anybody did. When I was running the race in the 90s, I actually hired the UCLA drug testing, and we just did urine tests, and we never detected anything. I'm not sure what you would do probably EPO would work for any kind of endurance, I suppose. And if people were doing it, I have no idea. It's possible, I guess.
I mean, in the Race Across America, I was watching some clips, and you were in such agonizing pain. I mean, you'd think painkillers would help.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
But it could also put you to sleep or something. I mean, and you're already falling asleep on the road.
For me, the competition for me was less the other people in the race, although of course I wanted to win. But really, it was just me against myself and the environment. I always thought of long distance cycling and RAM in particular as more of a like Mount Everest. It's just me against the mountain. I'm just doing it for myself. I like the challenge. I like being outdoors, and I like, the environment going by and wind, and, I just like being outside, and the fact that there were other competitors, that's great. But so to me, to dope or to cheat or whatever, it's like sort of defeats the purpose because it's just for me anyway. So
I think that was also the case for Greg. I argue in the book that he saw cycling, again, getting back to the abuse he'd suffered, as something pure and something he could excel at, and it felt good. His relationship with the bicycle felt pure, I think, to him, just like his relationship with Kathy, his wife. And those are two things that were, like, I think, beacons to him. And I don't think he wanted to pollute either one of them. At least that's the theory that I put forward in the book. But to get back to doping, the thing that I think is good to know, whether you're a cycling buff or you're not, and Laurent Fignon in his memoir puts this forward pretty well, that there are two eras in cycling in doping, just like in baseball. Okay, there's the before and the after. In baseball, they took this and that, caffeine and speed and who knows what, and then at a certain point around 90 something, suddenly there's steroids, and all of a sudden you have these bulked up superheroes hitting 70 home runs and throwing no hitters at age 42 and things like that, which are sick, crazy, that couldn't have been done before then.
Right.
Same exact thing in bicycling. So if you're not familiar with cycling, it's the same thing basically. Back in the teens and the 20s in the Tour de France, which was very similar in spirit to the Race Across America, just utter agony for 3 weeks in a row. People would use, I think, strychnine and cocaine and stuff that was really dangerous, anything to keep them up on their bikes, to keep them from falling asleep, to take some of the pain away. The famous Tom Simpson, the British cyclist, I think had alcohol and speed in his system when he died, when his heart sort of seized up on I think it was Mont Ventoux. So all that happened all the way up through Greg's era. And then again, around 90, around then, you had suddenly this thing, EPO, which started out as a legitimate product that I think was used for people who had was it anemia? I can't
Yeah,
remember now.
it's an anemic drug for, but particularly for cancer patients that were undergoing chemotherapy. It wiped out their marrow's production of red blood cells.
Red blood cells.
Right. So EPO is a erythropoietin. It's a re-engineered, genetically engineered drug to stimulate the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, which is a lifesaver for people. It's, this is Amgen is the company that produces it, and so there's some irony in the fact that they sponsor the tour of California. Everybody gets free samples.
I was stunned when I figured that out. Yeah. That's bizarre. Yeah. Anyway, so EPO, as I understand it, allowed cyclists to, basically process a lot more oxygen, right? And so it could give them arguably a 5 or 10% advantage out on the road.
Yeah.
I never took it, so I don't know anything about it, but that's what they said. And so all of a sudden, and 5 or 10% at the level at that level of competition is victory versus defeat.
Right.
And I gather that it started with certain competitors, maybe some Dutch people, maybe some Italians. There were some people dropping dead in their mid-20s kind of mysteriously, because it also, apparently it's a coagulant.
Right.
And so
if your hematocrit level is, the percentage of red blood cells in your blood. So the rest of it is not red blood cells. So 50% would be half of your blood is red blood cells. So for most men like you and I, it's probably between 40 and 50. We might be 42, 43, 44, whatever. If you're down in the low 30s, you're starting to get anemic, and if you hit in the 20s, then they're going to put you in the hospital with a blood bag and get you back up, top you off like that. So the red blood cells through hemoglobin delivers oxygen to your tissues. So the more you have, the more oxygen you get to your tissues, including your muscles. And so if 45% is better than 40, then 50 must be better than 45. And if 50 is good, well, then 55 must be really good. And I might as well go for 60, because the guy over there, I know he's doing 55.
Yeah.
So if I can get up to 60. And so Bjarne Riis, the 1994 Tour de France winner, I think it was, or 96, his nickname was Mr. 60%.
Mr. 60%.
Yeah. So but that gets dangerous now, because I've talked to medical doctors about this. That if you're above 60%, they're going to also put you in the hospital and put a saline drip on you to thin your blood out, so you don't stroke out. So there's a fine line now. So it's not clear to me, because I've had people challenge me on this, because I thought the same thing you thought, that these Dutch riders were dropping dead in their sleep. Young men in their 20s, super fit. In the middle of the night, their heart rate drops because they're so healthy and they're relaxed and so on. And then the blood jams up and they stroke out or have a heart attack. And a number of them apparently died. But I've been told that autopsies were not done and they just assumed it was related to the drugs. Okay.
That sounds right. That sounds accurate. What I do know, and I've gone over this at some book talks, and it's kind of a controversial point to make, but when the cycling teams, they all ride for teams at the Tour, when the teams took over the doping, I suppose they would have made the argument that was for the better, because you would then have some kind of doctor overseeing the preparation. They always use that term, preparation,
right?
Rather than a 25-year-old
in his hotel
cyclist,
room guessing.
Yeah, trying to. It would be like shooting up or something. It couldn't be. That can't be safe.
Right.
So once it was under the organization of teams, I suppose it was safer. I mean, albeit illegal against the rules, but at least it was maybe safe by then. And so back to my book, one entire chapter has my heroes, Greg and Laurent Fignon, the man he beats in '89, puzzling over their diminished performance in the 1990s, the Indurain era, Miguel Indurain, the tall Spaniard who was the first person in history to win 5 consecutive tours. Anquetil couldn't do it, Merckx couldn't do it, Hinault couldn't do it, but somehow Indurain could. Anyway, so in that era, our guys, even though they're just as good physically, just as powerful, they can no longer win. And people who were doing
not just not win, but they're getting dropped.
Getting
former
dropped.
domestiques who were water bottle carriers.
Of their own generation, too. These were people they could have easily beaten several years earlier. And then you even get later on into this theory that some of the malaise Greg spends years trying to diagnose. He winds up with this diagnosis of multiple myopathy, a disease of the mitochondria, the little energy factories in the cells. But you could even look at all of this as being the compounded effect of trying to keep up with a race that was just going a hair or two faster than it had before, and just exhausting himself daily. And, what does that look like after 3 weeks if you're not on this thing, and if the other leaders are? What does that do to your body? What if Lon Haldeman and Michael Seacrest had been on some special thing that made them 10% faster? I mean, you would have been destroyed. I mean,
Yeah.
And that's what was happening to them.
So this gets to a moral question related to game theory. But let me note parenthetically for my listening fans, I'm cured of Hep C. In I think around 2003 or 4, there's a drug regime you can take, and it's even better now, that eradicates it. So I don't have it anymore, which is a good thing, because Hep C is ultimately will kill you. So that's part of the context of not wanting to do bags of blood. Just sounded so gross. Yeah. But so two things. One, there was blood doping in the early 80s. After the 84 Olympics, it was banned by the IOC, and people were still doing it. But so to the question is, surely Greg was doing something. Everybody was doing something. I mean, we don't know everybody was doing drugs, but a lot of people were doing drugs, probably blood doping. How do we know Greg didn't do it? Now, I've asked him. I know Greg a little bit. I wouldn't say we're good friends. I haven't talked to him in many years, but he said no, he didn't do it, and I have no reason to doubt him. But on the other hand, if everybody's doing something and he's off the charts better, then surely he must have done something. How do you respond to that?
No, that's a great question, and it's been posed to me numerous times at my talks. And Lance posed that question to Greg, supposedly on this telephone call, this apocalyptic telephone call, after Greg says, it's the greatest fraud if this guy's doping. So Lance calls him and says, "Come on, you mean to tell me you never did this?" And he, according to Greg's recollection of the call, Lance rattles off a list of substances and said, "You're telling me you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't HGH, testosterone, blah, 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 blah." I don't know for sure. I know that Greg, says he didn't dope. I know that the dozens of people I interviewed for my book, whenever I thought of it, I would ask them, so, "Do you think he doped? Do you think he ever doped?" And of all those people to whom I posed that question, and these were peers of his, only one said that he thought that he did. And this is a person I'm sure but I can't say who he is because he didn't want to say it on the record. And his evidence of the doping was, I guess you'd call circumstantial. His evidence was quite simply the famous time trial, the time trial that concluded the 1989 Tour, the one that caused Greg to win the race by 8 seconds after entering this short time trial with a deficit of 50 seconds. He turns it around to the tune of 58 seconds and wins. And the theory is he couldn't have done that without some kind of chemical aid. So, and that's I think, to the extent that Lance ever made a case against Le Mans, I think that's the case. It's that time trial wouldn't have been possible without drugs. So I don't know for certain. I have no proof one way or the other.
I know nothing's ever come out. Again, to me, Greg strikes me as a very honest man of high integrity, but I don't know. So does Eddie Merckx, and we know he was doing stuff. And all the greats. Anquetil famously said, "You don't expect us to do this race on bread and water, do you? Come on."
Well, I will say that in my book, first of all, the book kind of proceeds from Greg's perspective. So you are basically seeing everything through Greg's eyes. And so when I say in the book, well, Greg didn't do this because he didn't dope, and the reason he didn't dope was he hated needles and blah blah blah, I sort of presume the book sort of presumes that Greg doesn't dope because it's from his perspective, more or less. But if I to answer this question, well, okay, do I know? I do not know. Do I think he doped? No, I don't think he did, because there's this just chorus of people saying that they don't think he did, and then no one's ever produced it. And then furthermore, you go to Laurent Fignon's argument. This is the guy he beat in '89. In his memoir, he asserts that ultimately the fact that Laurent Fignon took some amphetamines here and there mostly in the criteriums, the fun sort of entertainment races, and took some corticosteroids, which have been described to me as sort of like aspirin, basically. Doesn't really matter as far as it's not transformative. It's not decisive. Those kinds of dope that Fignon dabbled in couldn't possibly have transformed him into a champion if he were anything less than a champion. And I would say that nothing that was on the market prior to about 1990 was transformational. There was nothing on the market that could make somebody win 5 tours consecutively, or that could make somebody who was a domestique win the tour. So even if Greg, and I pray that he wasn't, even if he was taking stuff, he wasn't taking that stuff.
Well, there wasn't anything. Well, okay, so the blood doping was available in the 80s, and that apparently does make a difference. It's comparable to EPO in the sense that it has the same effect of just packing in more red blood cells, although it's a little riskier. We just don't know. Yeah. My inclination, just you're innocent until proven guilty, fine. But I'm not sure about the circumstantial evidence of that particular time trial. I could definitely see. I mean, he didn't win by that much. It's not like he beat Fignon by 5 minutes or something. If there's an effect, it's a tiny effect. But back to your description of what happened to Greg toward the end of his career as this EPO is introduced, and now instead of a 0.5% difference because of some drug that may or may not work, it's 10% difference. Now, Greg could make the moral decision, I'm just not going to do that. I think you talk about it in the book where his teammates come to him and say, Greg, everybody's on this new stuff. We got to get on this. He's, I'm not going to do it. Now, he's already had a successful career, and he's fairly well off financially, and he could afford to do that. Let's say you're 19 or you're 20, and this is your dream. And Tyler talks about this, where they gave him the white bag and says, you get to be in the tour this year, and here's the preparation bag, wink, wink. Everybody knows, you're going to get EPO and all the other stuff. Now, you could say no, but then what? Then you go back to flipping burgers at McDonald's. You don't have a life. So I can see if I just want to take the perspective not as a moralizer and say this is wrong or it's cheating, just why do athletes dope? What's the game theoretic model going on? What's the calculation they're making in their heads about a rational choice? It's kind of rational choice theory in economics, that people make decisions based on how they can advance their career or whatever. Greg could say no and walk away, and he still has a great life. But someone like Lance, let's say, or it doesn't have to be Lance, just any of those guys, everybody's doing it. Everybody knows that everybody's doing it. That I know that that I know, and so on. And even though it's unspoken, the Omerta rule, the Whisper Network tells us what everybody's doing in the peloton. So your choice is, I got to do it. So, like, for example, one of Lance's teammates in 99 and 2000, Frankie Andreo, I interviewed for an article I did on Scientific American about this very subject, why do athletes dope? And he said he didn't really want to do EPO, but it was clear he had to do it just to keep up, not to win. He said, I had no chance of ever winning the Tour de France. I'd be lucky to win a single stage. I just was getting dropped on just rollers, whereas before I could stay up toward the front of the peloton and I'd drop these other guys and I was pretty strong, but I wasn't going to win, but I could do my job. At some point by 95 or 6 or whatever it was, when it began to change, all of a sudden they're just going over rollers, not the big, huge Mont Ventoux climbs, but just the rollers. He would drop back to the team car, get some water bottles and food, bring it back up to the front for the teammates, Lance and the other guys. And he couldn't do it because everybody in the peloton is now going like 4 miles an hour faster up the climb than they normally would. And that's a lot when you're already like right at the limit. And then it bumps above your limit and then you're dropped and then you can't even compete. So I can really see why, I got to do it, or else I don't even have a job. Yeah. So I don't know what you think about that. I mean, it's, yes, it's breaking the rules, it's cheating and all that, but let's take that out of it and just say, can we understand why they do it?
Well, I think I believe, okay, and at my book talks, there's kind of two camps. There's one camp that's basically very pro Le Monde and hates, Lance, and says he was, cheater pants and all that. There's another camp in the center of the cycling universe that is very much defends Lance and agrees with him on his sort of defense is, I was just doing what everybody was doing, what I had to do to keep up. And Lance's approach to cycling was to get the best of everything, to pursue the best coach, the best doctor, the best team, the best. He had a parade of amazing lieutenants. The best lieutenants. For people not familiar, that's the one who kind of ushers you up the mountains. And yes, the best preparation. And so the people who are kind of Lance apologists would argue that, in fact, it was all about keeping a level playing field, and that any contender in that era had to take those things. Forget the morals of it. They just had no choice if they wanted to contend. And my understanding is, and I don't know all that much about that era, but there were maybe some French teams and certain riders who chose not to do the hardcore dope. And, you can see from the results that they never won.
Right.
So yeah, I suppose that by the time you get to this era of fairly pervasive and extremely effective doping, if you're a professional rider who wants to contribute or wants to contend, you'd have had very little choice. And the thing that, as it relates to my book, is that back in the 80s, I guess the riders weren't faced with that terrible choice, because you apparently could still win a race without the dope, because the dope wasn't, it simply wasn't decisive the way it became later.
Yeah. So I'm not a Lance critic or apologist. I'm just, like a social scientist interested in understanding human behavior. But I've met Lance, and it's pretty clear he's a very, very competitive guy. But a lot of top athletes are that way. I mean,
sure.
To say Lance wanted to win is like saying, well, Kobe Bryant wanted to win as many titles. Yeah. Well, of course, that's what you're supposed to do. And so I can see, when you're faced with that scenario, and everyone before you has kind of done it hit and miss, kind of amateurish. And there's this one guy, Michele Ferrari, the notorious Italian blood doctor, who seemed to have figured out the formula, which is to say, to people not familiar with this, like we were talking about before, back in the 50s or 60s or 70s, whatever, riders are just on their own, doing whatever they could do. You're in your hotel room. How much of my stuff am I supposed to take? Well, ask Bob. Maybe he knows. What? So... in other words, Lance just said, look, everybody's doing this, and they're doing it kind of unprofessionally. Why don't we just hire the best guy? Everyone on the team is going to be on the program, so that we're doing it professionally, and you time the drugs so that they're safe. I mean, Michele Ferrari's point about his little famous orange juice line about, even orange juice is toxic or whatever it was, at the wrong dose. So it's the dose that counts. Again, over 60% hermetic crit, dangerous, under 30 is dangerous. So there's a window in there. Why not just calibrate the science of doping? It's being done anyway, and we're not going to change the sport. So why don't we just hire the best people and just do it right? And to that extent, I can see, like, yeah, that seems like a good argument. Yes, it's still violating the rules, it's cheating and so forth, but everybody's doing it. How's a single rider going to change the whole sport? When you're in the middle of it, why not just go with the flow and just do it professionally? So I could see that argument as neither apologizing for Lance or critiquing the sport. It's just that was kind of the way it was.
Well, and I like to fancy myself like you as somebody who's fairly neutral on the question of Lance good, Lance evil. He's a character in my book, and I was a big fan of him back when he was competing, and I was maybe less shocked than most to find out that he was doping, because I assumed that the GC contenders were all doping.
And they were. We know that they were. And that's the other thing. I mean, no one in his circle of competitors has ever said, yeah, he was doping, well, I want the jersey, or bump me up in the rankings, because they all know they were doing it, and they're going to keep their mouths shut.
there's this fascinating disconnect now, and I've seen it since my book came out. On the one hand, you have sort of the mainstream press, let's say the reviewers of my book in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Seattle Times, and so forth. Those writers who are more like me, like just mainstream journalists, talk very, very dismissively and derisively of Lance, as if the whole Lance thing is a big joke now. Really, very, very derisively on the whole. And that's probably the perception of a lot of the mainstream of the American public now, this sense that he is a disgraced fallen athlete, right? I mean, I don't think I'm too far off.
No, I think that's probably right.
And then the closer you get to the core of the sport, and here's where things get fascinating. At my book talks, you'd have half the audience who were of that mindset of they think Lance worthy of ridicule. And then the other half are really of one mind with Lance himself and believe the theory that they were all doping, that Lance climbed all those mountains himself, that he perhaps was the dominant rider of his sport, of his era, the dominant cyclist of his era. And that, he wasn't cheating any more than anybody else was in that period of time. Now, I think what gets really interesting is to ask, well, what if you took a Lance Armstrong, take that human being, and swap him out with the leader of, say, an unsung French team? What would he have accomplished then? And that's a question that might be of more interest to the Lance apologists, because they think he was the greatest rider of his generation. Well, fine, if that's the case, then you could take Jan Ullrich and put him, sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here, take a great rival of Lance's like Jan Ullrich, the great German steam engine, put him atop the postal team, and take Lance and maybe put him atop a lesser team, and then let's see what happens then.
I think that's, it's entirely possible that Jan Ullrich would have won 5, 6, or 7 tours in that case, because he had the natural talent. We know for sure he was doping because he got caught in the Operation Puerto. Case. This was the Spanish police and authorities just broke into this guy's lab and found all the blood bags, and I guess his coding system wasn't very high-tech security. I think he used the rider's initials or something like that. And Tyler Hamilton talks about that because he got swept up into that as well, that the guy had mixed up one of his blood's a bag and he got somebody else's blood and got sick from that. And that I think it was Floyd, maybe it wasn't Operation Puerto with Floyd, but Floyd Landis, when he got popped for doping and stripped of his Tour de France title, he said, I was doping, but I wasn't doing that. I was doing this other thing. Anyway, because the doctor did something, screwed up something. Anyway, but that shows you, sort of Lance's attention to detail. Some doping doctors are better than other doping doctors. And so we got the best guy and Ullrich got the second best guy or the third best guy or whatever, and maybe that makes a difference. Okay, well, this is so speculative. We just never know because we can't rerun the tape, obviously, and adjust the variables. But clearly someone like Ullrich is probably the best example because he's probably the most gifted athlete. He won the gold medal in the Olympic cycling, and Lance's closest competitor for many years, also doping. So if you took the dope away from both of them, it isn't clear, who would be the dominant one, but it would be pretty close. So maybe the best guy or mostly won.
If Greg were here on this call with us, what he would say is that he thought Lance to be, I think in his words, top 30 at best, based on his VO2, based on his physiological profile. I would probably give Lance more credit than that. I'm not sure that I believe that he was the outstanding rider of his generation. My gut tells me that someone like Ullrich or Berlocchi or Basso or somebody like that might have been the better cyclist. The problem with cycling is that you've never had a level playing field ever, really.
Right.
Since time immemorial,
right.
This solo sport has been practiced by these teams. And so your fate as a rider in the Tour hinges on how good your team is, how many of your 9-person team, how many of them remain in the sort of back end of the 3-week race, whether you have a superstar sort of Floyd Landis style lieutenant beside you or you do not, whether you have, whether you have company in the mountains, teammates or you do not.
Yeah.
So it's never been level. It's never been level. But I would argue that it got a lot less level during the EPO era.
Yeah.
And when you get to Lance's team and when people in the general public sort of smell fraud and all that, I think they don't know the sport that well, but I think what they're recognizing is that the sort of level of unfair advantage that might have been bestowed upon Lance's team was, I think, of a factor of magnitude maybe greater than the unfair advantages
that's possible.
Et al. Enjoyed back in their day.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think Lance didn't do himself any favors in being sort of a didn't suffer fools gladly, as they say, at a pretty rough temperament in terms of dealing with people and alienated a lot of people, which is what ultimately I think brought him down. If he had stayed retired, he could be governor of Texas by now or something. But not just the comeback, but alienating Floyd Landis, who served his time after getting busted for drugs and wanted to come back, and apparently Lance didn't accept him to be on the team or Radio Shack team or whatever. And then that's when he got pissed and went and called the authorities. So I mean that's another side of dealing with other people that can make or break you. But I think he also didn't help himself in the Oprah interview. He made that line about, I did drugs like I put air in my tires. The average viewer really doesn't understand what that means. I mean, it's what we've been talking about. There's this 100 different things you got to do to prepare. Yes, air in your tires, right? Water in your bottles, and so on. But also the amount of sleep you get, and diet, and training, and not just any training, but what kind of training. Which days are you doing hills and intervals? Other days slow, long, and so on. That's all kind of refined into a science, and you got to put a lot of effort into that. And Lance did that as well. And, the body weight, just, for every 1 pound overweight, that's 1% loss of performance. So, if you're 10 pounds overweight, you're 10% lower than the guy next to you if he has the same other parameters as you and he's training the same amount as you. So, just, weight loss, what you eat, watching what you eat, and so on. And so I think to Lance's credit, he paid attention to all of those details, the 100 different things you got to do. And then luck. He himself says how lucky he was to not have crashed. We've seen like what happens to some of the top stars in the last decade or so. They win, and then the next year they crash and break their wrist or whatever. They're out. This happens a lot.
Look at Beloki. He had a horrible crash, and I think that was the one where Lance did some sort of mountain biking to get through the field and get clear of it.
Yeah, and I don't think he ever came back from. I think he broke his hip. These guys are pretty fragile out there. They don't have a lot of extra body fat and weight on there. Yeah, so I mean, you put all that together, and Lance is he was a great athlete. He's still a great athlete, but not explaining that. If I was to advise him, I think he might be doing a book. I don't know, but I would explain everything we've been talking about. Look, when I entered the sport, here's what was going on. Now I know he's probably nervous about doing that because he doesn't want to name names or whatever. There's people still working in the sport. Okay,
well, he doesn't have to.
You don't have to name names. Just say just kind of the game theory analysis. Like this is what you're faced with the choice. I'm going back to Austin and work in a bike shop, or else I can try to be a champion. Well, okay, that's kind of what I was facing, and I wish he would explain that to Oprah. Just everything we've been talking about. And
maybe he was speaking more to the insiders, to the core cycling fans, because they all got what he said on Oprah. I understood his argument from the moment he made it. I remember watching it, but people in the press, in the mainstream press, said, "Man, this guy's delusional to think that it's okay because everybody was cheating." I think ultimately the sort of, if there was a downfall for Lance, the problem is that he had this massive fan base of people who didn't really understand the sport and just worshipped the guy because he was this amazing American hero off doing this kind of fringy sport. And there were all these cancer survivors and people who knew all about him because of Sheryl Crow and the bracelets and, who weren't cycling buffs at all. And that's wonderful. He enjoyed a much larger fan base probably than any other cyclist in history. But then the flip side of that is that when he went down, most of those people went down with him. They didn't understand his defense. They didn't have any room in their hearts left for this guy who, God help us, was cheating, this cancer survivor. Oh my God, he betrayed them all.
Right.
And they, millions of these people, and I'm sure Lance has run across many of them in the last several years, just have nothing but disdain for him now. And again, once you have to get in toward the core of the cycling community to find these people who really do understand what you're talking about and what Lance was talking about in defending himself, saying, I was just doing what everyone was doing. And there's nuance here because I would argue he was doing it better, a lot better. And the things that he was doing that weren't strictly speaking within the rules, make it seem more like cheating. But he was also doing the legal things better, like having a better teammate, having a better doctor, having better tires. God knows what he had that was better. And 98 of those 100 things are perfectly permissible in cycling, right?
Right.
It's part of the unfair advantage that's okay to have. And it's a weird factor of cycling. You don't have this in baseball. When a person comes up to bat, it's just the guy and the bat. There's not 100 different factors that you can control that can give you an unfair advantage.
Our sport's been so picked on by the media, but I mean, the doping's just got to be rampant in like the NFL, if not for performance, just for survival, because it's such a hard sport. I can imagine that we know that they have been. I don't know if they still are taking lots of the like human growth hormone and testosterone and steroids, if nothing else, just for injury recovery, because there's so many injuries in football. In terms of like the doping protocols and NFL, last time I looked at it, if you want to do a drug test on an NFL player, you have to contact his agent and you set up a date and a time when it's like, oh, come on, please. This is also set up for just sort of a show. For a while in the 90s when I was running Race Across America, I had an argument with my sports physiology doctor, Randy Ice, about just legalizing it. Not just in RAN, but everywhere, just all sports. Just legalize it. Let these guys do whatever they want. And I have to say that's not a bad argument. It's kind of a libertarian argument. These are consenting adults. It's their bodies. They can do whatever they want. And if everybody's sort of up front and out in the open, then we all know who's doing what. And so just do that. But the counter argument to that is, but then it will trickle down to the lower levels, down to the juniors and then high schoolers and then junior high schoolers, and almost like the parents that want to get their kids into the super good preschool in New York City so they can get to this school and end up in Harvard. You might start too early with kids, and so that's a counter argument to that.
This is the Icarus effect. Everybody wants to try it and see if it can make them better too. Like that movie. Well, just to circle back, I want to emphasize that to anyone who might read this book, that I wrote this book in large part as a celebration of a more innocent time that you and I both remember, a time when the achievements of these great athletes felt genuine and felt like they meant something and were not tainted by anything. I mean, goodness, the stuff that counted as dope in the 70s and 80s, again, none of it was sort of decisive. And so it was just this happier era. And so I would say 80% of my book dwells in this really happy time, a time that nobody now, at this point in history is questioning anything that went down in professional cycling really in the 70s and 80s. That's a golden era, I think. And an era of great nostalgia for people who've seen what's happened since then. Much like in baseball, right? If you go back to the big red machine of the 70s or the Pittsburgh Pirates, Willie Stargell era, Mike Schmidt, Henry Aaron, that's all remembered with great love and affection by the fans. And I swear to God, there really is that thing, and the same thing in cycling. The Le Mans era is a wonderful era, and I wrote the book to celebrate that era. I felt like you and I, cycling fans, deserved a celebratory work celebrating a great golden era in the sport. So all this stuff we've been talking about, that's the final act of my book, and it's a sordid act, but the rest of the book is happy.
It is. No, it's a great story. And I wrote a biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, who's dead for a century, British naturalist. But what's it like to write a biography of someone who's still alive?
Challenging, because what do I do when I call up Kathy Lamond, who's kind of Greg's publicist, I guess, for lack of a better. I mean, she's the one who takes calls from in the outside world to say, well, I want to write a book about your husband. What is she going to think?
Right.
And I had to spend the first weekend with the two of them, to some extent convincing them I wasn't a loony, and that I was a real guy, a real journalist, a real writer. And then after that, because this was a celebratory work, I never figured there'd be any doubt that Greg would be into it, that he'd like the idea of my writing the book. But neither could I be sure that he would cooperate, and I was very fortunate that he did. He's a very hard guy to get. He's a notoriously difficult interview just because just getting him is very hard. He's great, and once you're with him, he's delightful, but it's hard to get him, to pin him down.
Why is it hard to get him?
I think back to the experience I had when I tried to interview Ron Howard for my book about Mayberry, or Jim Nabors, or who's that wonderful actor who was in the Fargo reboot, Billy Bob Thornton.
Oh, yeah.
So for each of those interviews, I had to labor and labor and labor to get them, and that's because they're big celebrities. They're great guys, each of them, but they're very difficult interviews to get because they're so damn busy. And the same thing with Greg. In his world, he's a huge Titanic star, so he's always being sought by innumerable people. I know that the random person on the street doesn't know much about who he is, but in cycling, as you know, he's enormous. He's a huge name. So just to get him, pin him down for an interview was very, very challenging. And I was able to do it a few times, and I'm very, very happy that it worked. But yeah, it's a different beast writing about the living than writing about the dead. And with my last book with Andy Griffith and Don Knotts, they were both deceased. And so thank goodness I didn't need sort of Andy's blessing to write a book about him, because I wouldn't have gotten it, I can promise you.
That's kind of speaking of sort of a pure, innocent time. That show is kind of trying to capture that. Is it too much whitewashing of Americana?
Well, my book is about the real men, these two very, very talented, very intelligent Hollywood stars who portrayed very clean scrubbed characters on television and tried to recapture sort of an idealized Hallmark card version of their own lives. Their own lives were quite dark. And I don't mean they were, bad people. It was that they'd been through terrible things, both of them. But they rendered it in the sweetest light in Mayberry and made the show into something sort of idealistic, sort of utopian. But my book tells the real stories of the real people. I just noticed on Wikipedia this morning that Anita Corso, the actress who played Helen Crump, the school teacher, she had an affair with Andy in real life.
Oh, really?
And that's one of the things that's in my book. It's real stuff. And I noticed they added it to Wikipedia, and I'm glad they did because it really did happen. But some of that stuff had my more zealous fans who read the book sort of reaching for their smelling salts. They were freaked out to learn that Andy swore, Andy drank, and he philandered, and Don had a pill problem at different times and also drank, and also I think had some, a wandering eye. So it's about the real people, and it would have been a tough project while they lived. With Greg, I didn't really have to deal with too much. Everybody loves this guy. Well, not Lance Armstrong, but most of the human race adores Greg. He's an adorable guy. Kathy's a wonderful woman. They're a sweet, sweet couple. They've been together longer than Sophie and I. We've been together since 1987. So thankfully there wasn't much. I tell real stories about him. There are some. He went through a really dark time, and at one point ran off with another woman to Vegas, and that's in the book. There's stuff that's dark that's in the book, but he's a pretty lovable character. So
they knew you were going to write about that, and that.
Oh yeah, and they, I had some conversations with them toward the end, right before it came out, where they were, I think, there was some stuff that they might have wished wasn't in there, but as far as I can tell, they're very happy with the resulting book. It is a celebratory book. A couple of the critics, a couple of the reviewers said that the work almost is a little too fanboyish, but I stand by it because he is a hero, a huge hero of mine, and I certainly, I'm a journalist. I worked at the Washington Post and the Miami Herald and elsewhere for more than 20 years. Wrote about bad cops and stuff. So I don't shy away from anything, and I put in there all the stuff I had to put in there to make him three-dimensional.
Yeah, for sure. You did. I thought you did a good job of that. And I think it's okay to have positive narrative stories that you're not distorting anything, but to a certain extent, art plays a role in sort of conveying what life could be like. like the Mayberry story. I mean, it doesn't have to be dark. I mean, why not portray a life that it would be nice if we could at least something to aim for. Not, I mean, we're never going to achieve utopia, but we might as well aim for something that's better. Than we have. If nothing else, it changes your perspective on how things are now, and it gives you something to work toward. So I think that's good.
Mayberry, the Mayberry show dwelt in sort of human frailties in a loving sort of way. Each episode had a lesson at the end, and they didn't even set out to do that, but that's what they ended up doing. As Larry David would say, this was a show with a lot of hugs and a lot of learning, which were abhorrent to him. And so no Seinfeld episode ever had hugs or learning. But there's a lot of hugs and a lot of learning in the Andy Griffith Show. But it's a lovely, lovely show.
I've been binge watching Black Mirror. Have you seen any Black Mirror episodes?
Oh, I did not sleep well after watching that.
They're pretty dark.
That you could create a virtual version of me and then like torture it for 1,000 years it doesn't sit well with you when you're going to sleep.
Right. I didn't see that episode. Okay,
well,
wow.
Brace yourself.
Well, this is sort of a new. I'm working on some different TV projects. It's one idea is to produce something like a Black Mirror about human nature and morality and that sort of thing, in the sense that you can explore themes and reach far more people through fiction, through novels, through film, through television drama, anthology series like Black Mirror or the Twilight Zone. I was watching a few Twilight Zones. Those are pretty, they're pretty simple and old now, but they still have messages and make you think. And that's some really good programming and writing.
Yeah, I think that when the Griffith Show was on, it was underrated. I think the show that stole all the awards during that era was Dick Van Dyke, which is a wonderful show as well, but maybe a tad overrated at the time, and the Griffith Show underrated. Yeah. Twilight Zone was beloved both by the public and also by the Hollywood literati. The great brains, the great minds in Hollywood all adored Rod Serling and his show. It was considered a huge breakthrough, and it's got a very passionate, enduring audience to this day. And if I ever do another television book, that would be a worthy topic.
What's your book I forgot to remember about?
It's a memoir of a woman who was hit on the head by a ceiling fan that fell from the ceiling as about a 21-year-old woman, and she never recovers from it fully, at least not cognitively. She winds up with total retrograde amnesia and literally never remembered a single thing that had happened before she was struck on the head. So it's her story. And it's a story of someone who sort of wakes up at age 22 with a husband she doesn't recognize and 2 infant sons she doesn't recognize, and sort of proceeds from there. And she winds up at the end of the book. She's about my age. She was in her late 40s and goes back to college and sort of tries to sort of liberate herself a little bit as a midlife woman who sort of woke up at age 20. So that's what that's about.
That's wild. That's the antithesis of the famous HM case. The guy that had part of his brain cut out, hippocampus cut out, and he could no longer form new memories. He only lived in the past.
Yeah, there's a chapter of Sue's book that talks about him and sort of the history of the science of amnesia. She also had anterograde amnesia, forward memory problems. And to this day, I was chatting with a friend on the commuter train this morning that anything that happens to her, if it's sort of ephemeral, she will have forgotten it about 3 days hence. And so if you if I had a little spat with her on the phone, I never did. I love her. She's wonderful. But if I ever had a spat with her on the phone, she would have probably forgotten it 3 days later, which could be good or bad depending on how you want your relationship to go.
What are you working on now? What's the next book?
Well, I'm this is the aforementioned commuter train. It's roaring past now. Well, I'm starting work on a biography of the late, great B.B. King.
Oh, wow.
I've already sold it to my current publisher. We have a great relationship, Grove Atlantic Books. And it's back to another thing that I know. I mean, you know how people are. The stuff that you're into, if you were to list 5 things you're really into, they're probably dissimilar one to the next. They're not all the same sort of thing.
Yep.
It's not like you're really into cycling and also cross-country skiing and also marathon running. Okay. So having dispensed with cycling, which was a huge childhood young adult passion, I'm moving on to a book in the music field. I think a really, really sincere and voracious student of popular music, rock and roll, jazz, country, blues, and I've always wanted to do something longer form on music. And with B.B. King, I'd like to do two things. One is to retrace the sequence of events that sort of caused, he sort of became the first guitar hero, and was the one who introduced the sound that defined sort of the lead guitarist of pop music for the latter half of the 20th century. So I want to tell that story because I don't know if people realize that really he was the one who coined that, from Spinal Tap.
Yeah.
He created that sound.
When was that? 50s? Late 50s?
His first singles were right around 1950. And it indirectly influenced everyone from Clapton to Santana to all of the lyrical lead guitarists of multiple generations, all the way up to the end of the century. And then it's also a story about the Great Migration northward of African Americans. In BB's case, he started out in Mississippi, and he actually sort of stopped in Memphis and then sort of was a citizen of the universe. But the book gives me a chance to recount this astonishing story for younger people of someone who was born a sharecropper without any sort of amenities, no plumbing, no electricity, lived in one room, and his mother died when he was a little boy, and then his grandmother died, and then he was basically alone and was living in an economic situation that's a step above slavery, basically. And just to go back and recount that, it's not been that long since he was a kid, for you and me anyway.
Right.
But it really sounds amazing when you tell it now. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Did he have influence on Elvis or vice versa?
They were contemporaries. They were friends. BB and Elvis, there's a famous meeting between them that happened at an event that was a charity event for Memphis's black population. And Elvis, being a real mensch, showed up. And he was like the only white guy in the whole hall.
Right.
And he came in there and belted it out, and they loved him. They gave him a huge standing ovation. And then he was already big at this point. And then he went and posed with BB for pictures and just said, he was just so glad to meet him. And he really revered BB, and BB later on would really revere Elvis. And then Elvis later gave BB King entree to Vegas, a land of which Elvis was basically the king.
Right.
So they had a great on and off relationship over the decades.
So you must get into the history of jazz going back to the start of the 20th century.
There's a guy named Lonnie Johnson who now I think might be the most overlooked guitarist in the history of the instrument. He started out playing the violin, and because he'd played the violin and the vibrato that all violinists use, he applied that to the guitar at a very early age. I'm talking like 1920s. Lonnie Johnson was playing vibrato single-string solos on acoustic guitar, which will blow your mind if you're a guitar historian. Everybody forgot him, but he wound up being a huge influence on BB, who didn't really create the single-string vibrato guitar solo, but BB turned it into sort of an electric thing and popularized it to where everybody could hear it. But yeah, Lonnie Johnson, he was both jazz and blues, and this was in an era when jazz and blues were intermingled, right? They weren't separate things necessarily.
Right.
And then you get characters like Charlie Christian, the great solo guitar guy played with, I think, Benny Goodman. I might be wrong about that. And then the three-fingered guitarist, I can't remember his name now.
I don't know.
Django Reinhardt, great jazz guitarist who also influenced. So BB was influenced by both jazz and blues guitarists, but more by the jazz guys than by B.B. King was not influenced really by Robert Johnson or Charlie Patton or the great sort of overall wearing blues guys. He was more influenced by the polished jazz guys.
I don't remember seeing any biographies of B.B. King. Have there been any?
Well, you're a book guy, so you'll appreciate that's basically why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
B.B. was the subject of a sort of an official biography, a third-party biography that published in 1980. Which is a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it was a very nice book, but there hasn't been a big biography of him since then. He published a memoir in 1996, which is now more than 20 years ago. And memoirs are just different beasts.
Yeah, of course, right.
You can do many different things in a biography than in an autobiography. But yeah, that's a lot of the reason why I'm doing it. I think that it was time to do one.
I want to write my own unauthorized autobiography. We're going to tell all the dirt.
Well, I saw a copy of your book on the race across America in the hands of a guy who came to one of my book talks, and I think
really?
he might have had you sign it too. But I want to get that one and read it because I that race and I go way back, at least as a fan.
Yeah. So what's Greg doing now?
He's involved in carbon fiber. And I hope I get this right. Up until a few years ago, he was making bicycles under the Le Mans name and doing, I think, a pretty good business on a small scale in Minneapolis. And then he got ambitious and decided he wanted to find sort of the holy grail, low-cost production technique for carbon fiber, and not just for bicycles, for other applications. I don't know what, maybe aerospace, maybe cars. And he started a company, I think it's now called Le Mans Composites. He teamed up with a group from Knoxville, Tennessee, from the research lab out there. I think it's called Oak Ridge. And then they had a falling out. But he's now teamed up with a different group that's from Australia, from Deakin University. And I stopped following the company when the book went to press. But knowing Greg, and he's a very smart, very ambitious guy, it'll either be a huge, massive success or it'll go down in flames. But either way, I know he'll give it the good effort. And they live in Knoxville now, a lovely, lovely area of Tennessee.
Oh, I didn't realize that's where Greg lives now.
They moved.
Okay, all right, very good. Well, Daniel, thank you for writing this book. Of course, as a cycling insider, I love reading every page. But to non-cycling fans, it's just a great narrative story. Again, it's the comeback. It's beautifully produced, by the way. I'm glad they included all the great photographs in there. And you're a really good writer. I'm looking forward to reading the B.B. King biography. That'll be great. It's probably going to be a few years in the making. There must be original materials you're getting that people haven't seen yet, and that sort of thing you're tracking down now.
You can count on it. And it's been a great pleasure talking to you. I have such fondness of you from back in the days when you were the marathon cyclist, and it's amazing the career you've built in the years since. I suppose most of the many people who know you now probably don't even know that about you.
Well, I realized in the I think it was the last time I did solo ram in 1985, how hard it is on the body, and not just the race, but just the training all year, just staying fit and all that stuff, and how time consuming it was. And I realized, I'm not going to be able to do this forever. And I really liked being a college professor. I was an adjunct professor, just teaching nights, intro psych at a community college while I was doing all that bike racing. And I realized, what, I'm not going to be able to keep doing this. I better get my doctorate and then develop a career as a writer or professor or something, because, as you said, athletes at the top of the game, you only have a few years, maybe a decade or so. And maybe golfers like Tiger can keep going into their 40s, but, the rest of the sports, you just can't. So that's why I did that, really, just because I still had drive and ambition, want to do something successful. You can only do it physically for so long.
Yeah. Well, you're one of a number of former cyclists I've had the great pleasure to talk to who've done amazing stuff. There is life after cycling, and you're living proof.
All right. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care.